I pulled the brittle paper from the envelope, my hands trembling as I read the words that shattered my life. My sister Eleanor's handwriting confessed she switched the baby tags at St. Mary's Hospital, giving me her sick infant and taking my healthy boy for herself. The date on the letter was from 30 years ago, the day my son Michael was born. He spent his life in and out of hospitals, while her son James became a star athlete. I had 2 hours before Eleanor returned from her bridge game, and I needed to find more proof in this attic. My heart hammered against my ribs, the musty air thick with betrayal. I rifled through another box, my fingers brushing against old photo albums and legal documents. This knowledge brought a searing pain in my chest as the foundation of my family crumbled to dust. Eleanor always held power over me with her perfect life and sharp tongue, but now I saw the rotten core. A floorboard creaked downstairs, and I froze, listening. It was just the old house settling, but the sound jolted me back. Then I spotted a small, locked metal box tucked behind a trunk, something I'd never seen before. Using a hairpin, I jimmied the lock open and found a stack of hospital receipts and a nurse's faded ID badge. A sudden realization hit me. Eleanor hadn't acted alone. The badge belonged to a woman named Carol, who worked maternity that night. As I pocketed the evidence, the front door clicked open downstairs, and Eleanor's voice called out, "Margaret, are you up there?" I held my breath. The papers clutched tight in my sweaty hand. I shoved the metal box back into hiding and slipped the letters into my apron pocket, descending the attic stairs with forced calm. Eleanor stood in the hallway, her eyes narrowing as she saw me. "What were you doing up there?" she asked, her tone light but edged with suspicion. I wanted to get out of the house with the evidence and confront her later, but being near her made me nauseous with churning fear. She stepped closer, her perfume suffocating, and I remembered how she'd always controlled our family dinners, dictating what we ate and said. "Just looking for Christmas decorations," I lied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. She smiled, that fake, tight-lipped smile, and said she needed to check something in the attic. As she brushed past me, I felt the weight of the papers burning a hole in my pocket. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, and I headed for the door, claiming I had to feed my cat. But then my phone buzzed. A text from Michael, my son, saying he was feeling worse and needed to go to the emergency room. An unexpected event twisted my plans. Now I had to choose between securing the truth or rushing to his side. I hurried to my car, the keys fumbling in my grip, and saw Eleanor watching me from the attic window, her expression unreadable. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed a familiar sedan pulling out behind me, following at a discreet distance. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, and I sat beside Michael, holding his hand as nurses buzzed around us. His fever was spiking again, another crisis in a lifetime of them, and the letters in my purse felt like a lead weight. I aimed to protect him from this ugly truth while gathering evidence to expose Eleanor, but guilt gnawed at me. I'd raised him thinking he was mine, and now every cough felt like my fault. Eleanor's influence loomed. She'd donated heavily to this hospital, and I worried she might have allies here who could interfere. Michael dozed off, and I stepped into the hallway to call my lawyer, my voice a hushed whisper. Suddenly, a nurse approached, not for Michael, but to hand me a sealed envelope. "A woman asked me to give this to you," she said, before walking away. Inside was a note. "Stop digging, or Michael's medical records might disappear." A chilling interruption sent a shiver down my spine. Someone was watching me, and it wasn't just Eleanor. A small shock came when I recognized the handwriting. It was Carol's, the nurse from the badge. I rushed back to Michael's room, but his bed was empty, the sheets rumpled and cold. I frantically searched the corridor, my breath catching in my throat, until an orderly pointed me to the radiology department. Michael had been taken for an unscheduled scan, he said, ordered by a doctor I'd never met. I needed to find him and get us both out of there safely, but panic rose as I realized Eleanor's web extended into this hospital. I stormed into the radiology waiting area, and there he was, pale but awake, with a young technician prepping him. "Who authorized this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The tech shrugged, citing a phone order from Dr. Evans, a name I didn't recognize. Eleanor's influence was everywhere. She must have called in favors to distract or discredit me. As I argued with the staff, my phone dinged with an email from an unknown sender. Attached were scanned pages from Michael's original birth file, showing the tag switch in detail, but with Eleanor's name redacted. This unexpected development made me pause. Was this a trap or help? A sudden detail struck me when I noticed a timestamp on the email, sent just minutes ago from an IP address linked to the hospital's network. Grabbing Michael's arm, I insisted we leave immediately. But as we reached the elevator, the doors opened to reveal Eleanor standing there, her face a mask of calm fury. "We need to talk, Margaret," she said, blocking our path. I pushed past Eleanor, pulling Michael with me toward the stairwell, his weak protests muffled by my grip. "Not here, not now," I hissed, and she didn't follow, but her eyes promised retaliation. I intended to reach my car and drive to a safe place, maybe my friend Betty's house, but fear clawed at my insides. Michael was confused and fragile, and I was dragging him into a war. We burst into the parking garage, the damp concrete echoing our footsteps, and I fumbled for my keys. Eleanor's resources felt infinite. She could have people tracking us, and I remembered how she'd always bragged about her connections in this town. As I started the engine, Michael slumped in the passenger seat, mumbling about dizziness, and I knew I had to get him home to his medications. But then my gas light blinked on. I'd been too distracted to fill up earlier. An unforeseen problem forced a detour to the nearest station, and as I pumped gas, a black SUV pulled up beside us, its windows tinted dark. A surprising moment occurred when the driver's window rolled down slightly, and a hand emerged, dropping a small object onto the pavement near my feet. It was a USB drive. I scooped it up, my heart racing, and drove off, watching the SUV fade in my mirror. At home, I plugged the drive into my laptop, and it loaded a video file, security footage from the hospital hallway 30 years ago, showing Eleanor and Carol switching the babies. But as the video ended, a text overlay appeared. "Delete this, or your grandson's school gets a visit tomorrow." I stared at the screen, the threat solid and real. I stared at the laptop screen, the threat burning into my mind as I deleted the video file, but secretly saved a copy to a cloud drive Eleanor couldn't access. My grandson, Tommy, was in kindergarten, and I couldn't risk his safety. I had to secure this evidence and confront Eleanor on my terms, but it was tearing me apart, each breath feeling like shards of glass in my chest. Eleanor's reach was long. She'd always controlled the family narrative, and now she had allies in shadows, threatening a child. I shut the laptop and hurried to hide a physical copy of the USB drive in a recipe book on the highest shelf, my hands shaking. Then, my phone rang. It was Tommy's school, saying he'd been picked up early by his aunt, a woman matching Eleanor's description. This sent me rushing to the car, my heart pounding. I drove toward the school, but then I remembered Eleanor never visited Tommy. She barely acknowledged him, Pulling over, I called the school back and learned the woman had used my name, not Eleanor's, and had Tommy's emergency contact details. As I sped through traffic, I realized someone had impersonated me, and when I reached the school parking lot, I saw Tommy playing alone on the swing set, unharmed but confused. A teacher approached, saying his grandmother had left minutes ago after a phone call, and handed me a note. Next time, he won't be returned. I clutched Tommy close, my body trembling, and noticed a black sedan idling across the street, its driver watching us. I bundled Tommy into the car and drove away from the school, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I needed to get us to a safe house, my friend Betty's cabin in the woods, and figure out who was helping Eleanor, but it was tearing my family apart, with Tommy scared and asking for his dad. Eleanor's influence was clear. She had people following me, and I recalled how she'd always mocked my simple life while she networked with powerful folks. I took back roads, checking the mirror for tails, and when I stopped for gas, I used a payphone to call Betty, avoiding my cell. She agreed to meet us, but as I hung up, a man in a hoodie approached, handing me a folded map. "For the lost grandmother," he said before vanishing. I was stunned. The map led to an abandoned farmhouse, with "evidence here" scribbled in red. Then I recognized the handwriting. It was Carol's, the nurse from the hospital. But why help me now? I drove toward Betty's, but as I turned onto the rural route, my car sputtered and died, out of gas, though I'd filled it recently. I got out to check, and Tommy pointed at the fuel line, cut clean through. Panic surged as I saw the black sedan parked 100 yards back, its engine off. I grabbed Tommy and my purse, abandoning the car to trek through the woods toward Betty's cabin, the map clutched in my hand. I needed to reach safety and decode Carol's message, but it was physically exhausting, my knees aching and Tommy whimpering in my arms. Eleanor's resources were overwhelming. She must have had my car sabotaged, and I remembered her boasting about her fixers at family gatherings. We reached a creek, and I followed it, using the map to navigate, when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Turn back, or the boy gets hurt." This made me freeze. I crouched behind a tree, scanning the forest. Then I spotted a drone hovering overhead, its camera pointed at us. I threw a rock, and it veered away, but not before dropping a small package, a burner phone. I picked it up, and it rang immediately. Betty's voice came through, saying she was detained and couldn't help. But the voice sounded off, too formal, and I realized it wasn't her. As we pushed on, the cabin came into view, but the door was ajar, and inside, furniture was overturned. I hid Tommy in the bushes and crept closer, finding a note on the table. "I know what you took. Return it, or I'll ruin Michael's life too." I backed away, and a shadow moved in the doorway. I yanked Tommy from the bushes and ran into the woods, the note crumpled in my fist. I needed to find a secure place to call for help and use the burner phone to trace the threats. But my hope was dwindling, each step fueled by fear. Eleanor's grip tightened. She'd invaded my safe space, and I recalled how she'd always undermined my decisions, calling me hysterical. We huddled under a dense thicket, and I turned on the burner phone, scrolling through its contacts. Only one number saved, labeled E. I dialed it, and a woman answered, her voice familiar, but strained. "Margaret, stop this before someone gets hurt," she said, and I recognized Carol, the nurse. She confessed that she helped Eleanor switch the babies, but regretted it. And now Eleanor was threatening her family too. Then she revealed Eleanor had a financial motive, a trust fund set up by our parents that only a healthy heir could access. Carol offered to meet me with proof, but as we arranged a location, the line went dead. I checked the phone. No signal. Tommy tugged my sleeve, pointing at a figure approaching through the trees, holding a flashlight. It was Betty, her face pale, and she whispered, "Eleanor's here, with the police. She's accusing you of kidnapping Tommy." I stood up, and beams of light swept over us, voices shouting to surrender. I raised my hands, Tommy clinging to my leg, as police officers emerged from the darkness, with Eleanor standing behind them, her expression smug. I needed to prove my innocence and expose the truth, but it meant legal entanglement, my reputation crumbling. Eleanor's power was on full display. She'd manipulated the system, and I remembered her donations to the police charity, always buying loyalty. An officer stepped forward, reading my rights, while Eleanor smirked and said, "She's unstable, officer, has been since her son's illness." Then Betty stepped between us, holding up her phone. "I recorded everything," she said, playing back Eleanor's earlier threat from the cabin. The officers hesitated, and then one officer, a younger woman, nodded to me and whispered, "I know about the switch. My mum worked at St. Mary's." She subtly motioned for me to follow her lead. As they cuffed Eleanor for filing a false report, she glared at me and hissed, "This isn't over." I hugged Tommy, relief washing over me, but then the young officer handed me a card. "Call me," she said. "There's more. Eleanor isn't working alone." I tucked it away, and as we drove to the station, I noticed the black sedan trailing us again, its windows rolled down, and a camera lens pointed straight at me. At the police station, I gave my statement while Tommy slept in a chair nearby, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The young officer, Lena, pulled me aside and said we needed to talk privately, her eyes darting toward the windows where the black sedan had parked across the street. I aimed to learn who else was involved in Eleanor's scheme and secure my family's safety, but the exhaustion was bone deep, my hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Eleanor's allies were still active. I remembered how she'd always surrounded herself with loyalists who did her dirty work. Lena led me to a small interview room and closed the door, her voice low as she explained that her mother was Carol, the nurse from the hospital, and Carol had been blackmailed by Eleanor for years. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from Michael, saying he was being discharged but felt watched at home. This sudden shift made me tense. I needed to get to him fast. Lena handed me a file folder, its contents showing bank transfers from Eleanor to a private investigator, the same man who'd been following me. As I scanned the documents, a detail jumped out. The investigator's name was linked to a law firm that handled our family's trust fund. I thanked Lena and hurried out with Tommy, but as we stepped into the parking lot, the black sedan's engine roared to life, and it sped toward us, its headlights blinding. I shoved Tommy behind a parked car as the sedan screeched to a halt inches away, the driver's door swinging open to reveal a tall man in a suit, the investigator from the file. I needed to confront him and retrieve any evidence he had, but my heart pounded with raw fear, the near miss leaving me trembling. Eleanor's network was relentless. This man had resources to track us anywhere, and I recalled how she'd always hired professionals to handle her problems. He stepped out, holding up his hands in a mock surrender, and said, "Let's make a deal, Margaret. Give me the documents and I'll call off the threats." Then, Lena emerged from the station, her hand on her holster, and ordered him to step back. An unexpected intervention stalled the confrontation, but as they argued, I noticed the man slip a small device from his pocket and drop it near my feet. I pocketed it quickly, and Lena escorted him away for questioning. Back in my car, I examined the device, a thumb drive, and plugged it into my laptop at a nearby cafe. It contained audio recordings of Eleanor discussing the switch with someone named the benefactor, a voice I didn't recognize. The recordings implicated a third party, but as I listened, a notification popped up on my screen. Remote access detected. I slammed the laptop shut, and the cafe's lights flickered, then went out. In the sudden darkness, I grabbed Tommy and the laptop, rushing out to the car as other patrons murmured in confusion. I intended to find a secure location to analyze the thumb drive and identify the benefactor, but paranoia set in, every shadow feeling like a threat. Eleanor's reach was technological now. She must have had someone hack my devices, and I remembered her boasting about her IT expert at a family reunion. I drove to a library across town, using their public computers to isolate the thumb drive's contents, but the system flagged a virus warning. A librarian approached, saying someone had reported my activity, and I needed to leave. This interruption forced me to abort. I deleted my history and fled, the thumb drive feeling like a bomb in my purse. As I merged onto the highway, my car's GPS glitched, rerouting me to an unfamiliar industrial area. I pulled over to reset it, and my phone rang, Betty's number. But when I answered, a distorted voice said, "Leave it alone, or the boy disappears for good." Then, the line went dead, and I saw a van idling behind me, its side door sliding open. I hit the gas, but my engine sputtered, and the van began to close the distance. I swerved into a narrow alley, the van's headlights glaring in my mirror, and parked behind a dumpster, killing the engine. I needed to ditch the car and find shelter on foot, but Tommy was crying, and I felt utterly exposed. Eleanor's allies were coordinated. The van's presence meant they'd tracked me somehow, and I recalled her cold advice to always have a backup plan. We slipped out and ran through back streets, my lungs burning, until we reached a small motel I'd used years ago. I paid cash for a room, barricading the door with a chair, and checked the thumb drive on my laptop using a borrowed hotspot. The audio files were corrupted, but one snippet was clear. The benefactor mentioned a fail-safe involving Michael's medical records. Then, my phone buzzed with an email from an encrypted address. It was Carol, saying she was in hiding but had physical proof at her sister's house, and she gave me the address. This new lead gave me hope, but as I read it, a knock came at the door. I peered through the peephole and saw Lena standing there, her face anxious. She said she'd traced my location because my phone was pinged, and we had to move immediately. As I opened the door, a shot rang out from the parking lot, and the window shattered behind us. I dragged Tommy to the floor, covering him with my body as Lena returned fire toward the parking lot. We needed to escape the motel and reach Carol's sister's house for the proof, but terror gripped me, the gunshot echoing in my ears. Eleanor's network had escalated to violence. I never imagined she'd resort to this, and I remembered her cruel taunts about being untouchable. Lena provided cover while we crawled out the back window into a dimly lit alley. She urged me to go to the address alone, saying she'd hold them off, and handed me a spare key to her car parked nearby. I drove off with Tommy, his sobs quieting as I sped toward the suburbs. The address led to a modest home with a neatly kept garden, and I approached the front door, my knuckles rapping softly. An elderly woman answered, her eyes widening when I mentioned Carol. She invited me in, and inside, on the coffee table, was a sealed envelope labeled "For Margaret." I opened it to find signed affidavits and photos from the hospital, clearly showing the tag switch. But as I sighed in relief, the woman's expression shifted, and she said, "I'm sorry, dear, but they promised to hurt my family if I didn't call them." She lifted a phone to her ear, and from the hallway, the The tall investigator stepped out, a smirk on his face. "Eleanor sends her regards," he said, advancing toward me. The investigator lunged for the envelope in my hand, but I shoved it into my purse and grabbed Tommy, backing toward the door. I needed to get us out of there alive and protect the evidence, but my legs felt weak, and Tommy's grip on my hand was trembling. Eleanor's man was blocking the exit, his smile cruel, and I remembered how she always sent enforcers to intimidate anyone who crossed her. The elderly woman whimpered an apology, but I saw a chance when the investigator's phone buzzed, distracting him for a second. I yanked Tommy sideways into the kitchen, spotting a back door, and we burst into the yard, the cold night air hitting my face. Then, a car engine roared from the street, Lena's vehicle, with her waving us over. This unexpected rescue gave me a burst of hope, and we scrambled inside, the investigator shouting after us. As Lena sped away, I checked the envelope. The affidavits were intact, but a photo slipped out, one I hadn't noticed before, showing Eleanor and a man I recognized as our family lawyer signing papers. I was struck by a sudden realization. The lawyer was the benefactor, involved from the start. Lena confirmed she'd tracked my phone and heard the shot, but as we turned a corner, a police barricade ahead flashed its lights, and an officer signaled us to stop. Lena rolled down the window, but the officer's expression was grim, and he said, "Margaret, you're under arrest for the abduction of Thomas Green." I stared, stunned, as hands reached in to pull me from the car. Handcuffs clicked around my wrists, and I was separated from Tommy, his cries echoing as a social worker led him away. I had to prove my innocence fast and use the evidence to expose the lawyer, but the humiliation burned, my age making me feel vulnerable in the stark interrogation room. Eleanor's influence had twisted the narrative. She'd filed formal charges, and I recalled her knack for making lies sound plausible. A detective laid photos on the table, shots of me with Tommy at the motel, framed to look suspicious. Then, the door opened, and Lena entered, her badge confiscated, saying she was suspended for aiding me. This setback crushed my spirit, but she whispered that she'd hidden a copy of the evidence with a reporter she trusted. As I was processed and put in a holding cell, a guard slipped me a note. "Check your shoe." When I did, I found a tiny USB drive tucked inside. Lena must have planted it during the arrest. I had a shocking realization when I found out it contained audio of Eleanor admitting the switch to the lawyer, recorded by Carol before she went into hiding. But as I clutched it, the cell door buzzed open, and the investigator stood there, holding a release form. "Eleanor dropped the charges," he said, "but she wants a meeting. Now." I stepped out, free but trapped, and saw Tommy waiting with a stranger, a woman who introduced herself as a court-appointed guardian. I hugged Tommy tightly, but the guardian said he'd be placed in temporary custody until the family situation was resolved. I needed to retrieve the evidence from the reporter and clear my name permanently, but the loss of Tommy felt like a physical blow, my heart aching with every breath. Eleanor's move was calculated. She'd used the system to isolate me, and I remembered her cold advice to always control the children. The investigator drove me to a quiet cafe where Eleanor waited, her posture rigid. She demanded I hand over all copies of the evidence, or she'd ensure Tommy was adopted out. Then, my phone vibrated. A text from the reporter, saying he'd published a snippet online and it was going viral. This interruption shifted the power. Eleanor's eyes widened as she checked her phone, seeing the news. She stood abruptly, hissing that I'd regret this, and stormed out. The investigator followed, leaving me alone. But as I called Lena to coordinate, a man approached. The family lawyer, Mr. Evans, his face pale. He admitted he was the benefactor, pressured by Eleanor to secure the trust fund, and offered to testify if I protected him from her. A surprising revelation came when he disclosed that Eleanor had a hidden account with funds from the switched inheritance. I agreed, but as we shook hands, a van pulled up outside, and men in masks jumped out, rushing toward the cafe. I ducked behind the counter, and the lawyer was dragged away, his screams cut short. I crawled out the back exit, my pulse racing, and ran through alleyways to Lena's apartment, using the key she'd given me. I aimed to consolidate the evidence and plan a public exposure, but fear gnawed at me. The lawyer's abduction showed how far Eleanor would go. Her resources included hired thugs, and I recalled her boasting about handling problems permanently. Inside, I found Lena packing a bag. She said we had to leave town because her superior was on Eleanor's payroll. We gathered the USB drives and affidavits, then drove to a remote storage unit Lena kept for emergencies. As we sorted the files, a news alert popped up on my phone. The lawyer had been found dead, labeled a suicide. This shocking event made me realize Eleanor was erasing loose ends. Then, Lena discovered a hidden file on OneDrive, a video of Eleanor and the lawyer discussing the switch, with a timestamp from the night Michael was born. I was taken aback when I spotted a shadow in the video, a third person, barely visible, who I recognized as our late father's business partner. Suddenly, the storage unit's lights flickered, and the roll-up door began to rise remotely. We scrambled to the back, but armed figures entered, and one called out, "Give us the files, or the boy gets hurt." I froze, recognizing Tommy's voice from a speakerphone one of them held. I shoved the evidence into a vent and raised my hands, my mind racing to protect Tommy. I needed to stall these men and signal for help, but it was driving me insane, each second feeling like an eternity. Eleanor's thugs were well armed, and I remembered her cold words about winning at any cost. One man stepped forward, demanding the files, and I lied that they were in my car. As we moved toward the door, Lena subtly triggered a silent alarm on her watch, a device she'd kept hidden. Then, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and this disruption made the men hesitate. They argued among themselves, and in the confusion, I grabbed a tire iron from a shelf and swung it, hitting one man's arm. He dropped the speakerphone, and I heard Tommy sobbing, but the voice wasn't his. It was a recording meant to manipulate me. The truth hit me hard. Eleanor had never taken Tommy. He was safe in custody, and this was a bluff. As police cars screeched outside, the men fled out the back, but one turned and threw a small device that sparked on the floor. It was a flashbang, and the world went white and loud. When my vision cleared, Lena was cuffing one captured thug, but she pointed to the vent. Smoke was curling out, and the evidence inside was burning. I rushed to salvage it, but the heat forced me back, and through the smoke, I saw the black sedan speeding away, Eleanor's face visible in the window, smirking. I lunged toward the burning vent, the heat searing my face as I tried to grab the smoldering evidence, but Lena pulled me back, her grip firm. "It's gone, Margaret," she shouted over the crackling flames, and I watched years of proof turn to ash, my hope crumbling with it. I needed to find another way to expose Eleanor and get Tommy back from custody, but the loss felt like a physical wound, my hands shaking from the near burn. Eleanor's escape in the black sedan showed her confidence, and I remembered how she'd always belittled my efforts, calling them amateur. Firefighters arrived, dousing the storage unit, and as they worked, Lena whispered that we had to move before more thugs showed up. We drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the room smelling of stale cigarettes, and I collapsed on the bed, exhausted. Then my phone dinged. a message from an unknown number with a link to a cloud storage folder. It contained backups of the evidence I thought was destroyed, including the video and affidavits, along with a note from Carol. She's safe. This unexpected salvation reignited my determination. But as I opened the files, a pop-up warned of a tracking signal embedded in the link. I quickly downloaded everything and disconnected, but the motel's window shattered and a canister rolled inside, filling the room with smoke. I grabbed Lena, and we stumbled into the hallway, only to see masked figures advancing from both ends. We retreated into a stairwell, the smoke stinging our eyes, and I clutched the phone with the downloaded files. I aimed to reach a public place and send the evidence to the media, but my lungs burned and Lena was coughing heavily. Eleanor's men were methodical. They'd tracked us through the digital breadcrumb, and I recalled her pride in covering all angles. We burst out into a back alley, the cold night air a relief, and spotted a bus idling at a stop. Boarding it, we slumped into seats, and I used the bus's Wi-Fi to upload the files to a secure news outlet, typing a quick summary. Then, the bus driver announced a detour due to police activity, and we were rerouted through a deserted industrial zone. This interruption made me uneasy. I peered out the window and saw the black sedan following at a distance. Lena suggested we get off at the next stop, but as the bus slowed, a news alert flashed on my phone. The story had broken online with headlines about the baby switch scandal. A small shock came when I saw Eleanor's photo splashed across the screen, but the article focused on her, not the lawyer's death or the trust fund. The bus doors hissed open, and we stepped out into a dimly lit street. But the sedan pulled up beside us, its window rolling down to reveal Eleanor herself, holding a gun. "Get in," she said, her voice cold, "or I shoot the boy." She gestured to the back seat, where Tommy was tied up and gagged. My heart stopped at the sight of Tommy, his eyes wide with fear, and I raised my hands, stepping toward the car. I needed to save him and use the public exposure to force Eleanor's hand, but the gun in her grip made my blood run cold. Eleanor's desperation was palpable. She'd kidnapped Tommy from custody, and I remembered her saying, "I always have a contingency." Lena moved to intervene, but Eleanor fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing in the empty street. "Just you, Margaret," she snarled, and I climbed into the passenger seat, the door locking behind me. As she drove off, I noticed her hands were trembling, and she muttered about ruining everything. Then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a call from Michael, but I couldn't answer. Eleanor snatched it and threw it out the window, but not before I saw a text preview. "James knows. He's on his way." This revelation hit me hard. James, her son, my biological son, had learned the truth. Eleanor sped through back roads, her knuckles white on the wheel, and she revealed she was taking us to a remote cabin to end this. But as we turned onto a gravel path, headlights flashed behind us, and a car rammed us from the rear, sending us skidding into a ditch. The impact jarred me, and I looked back to see James stepping out of the other car, his face a mask of fury. I scrambled out of the wrecked car, my body aching, and saw James advancing toward Eleanor, who was struggling with her door. I needed to de-escalate this and protect Tommy, but the raw anger between them was volatile, and I felt torn between my sons. Eleanor shouted at James to stand down, but he ignored her, yanking open her door and pulling her out. "You lied to me my whole life," he roared, and I recalled how she'd always controlled him with gifts and lies. Lena arrived in another car, having followed us, and she freed Tommy from the back seat, his small arms wrapping around my neck. Then Eleanor laughed. a harsh, broken sound, and said, "You think you've won? The trust fund is mine, and I've transferred it all." She pulled out a phone, showing a confirmation screen, but James snatched it and smashed it on the ground. This interruption shifted the dynamic. He turned to me, his eyes filled with pain, and said, "I'm sorry, Mom." He'd never called me that before, and the word lodged in my heart. But as we stood there, sirens wailed in the distance, and Eleanor smirked, saying she'd called the police and would frame us for her kidnapping. Headlights approached fast, and multiple cars surrounded us, officers pouring out. One approached me, but Lena stepped forward, showing her badge, and said, "I have evidence of the real crime." The lead officer nodded, but then he gestured to Eleanor, and she smiled, holding up a small device. "Too late," she said. "I just triggered a failsafe. The money's gone, and so is your proof." She pressed a button, and all our phones went dead, the screens blank. In the sudden silence, the officers hesitated, and I hugged Tommy closer, his whimpers soft against my chest. I needed to convince them of the truth and find a way to recover the evidence, but the digital blackout felt like a final blow. Eleanor's smug expression showed she'd planned for this, and I remembered her boasting about owning the narrative. James stepped forward, his voice firm, and told the officers about the switch, offering to testify, but they seemed skeptical without proof. Then, a van pulled up, and a woman I recognized as Carol emerged, holding a tablet. "I have it all here," she said, her voice strong, and she played the video of the switch for the officers. This unexpected turn left me breathless. Carol had survived and brought the original files. The lead officer watched, his face grim, and he ordered Eleanor's arrest. As they cuffed her, she spat at me. "You'll never see that money, Margaret." But Carol handed me the tablet, showing that the trust fund had been frozen due to the investigation. A small shock came when I saw a message from the bank. Our parents had set a clause that the fund would revert to me if fraud was proven. The officers led Eleanor away, and James approached, asking if we could talk. But as I nodded, my phone buzzed back to life with a call from Michael's hospital. I answered, and a doctor said Michael had taken a turn for the worse and wasn't expected to last the night. I sank to my knees, the victory feeling hollow, and Tommy's hand tightened in mine. I raced to the hospital with Tommy and Lena, the streets blurring as I prayed I wasn't too late. Michael's doctor met me at the ICU doors, his face grave, and said Michael had slipped into a coma, his organs failing from the lifelong illness Eleanor had condemned him to. I needed to be by his side, to hold his hand and whisper the truth. But the guilt was a crushing weight, each breath a reminder of the stolen years. Even from jail, Eleanor's shadow loomed. Her lawyer had filed motions to delay the trust fund release, and I remembered her cruel smile as she was taken away. Inside the room, Michael lay still, monitors beeping softly, and I sat beside him, telling him about his real mother and the switch. Then, a nurse rushed in, saying there was a commotion in the hallway. James had arrived, demanding to see his brother. This interruption pulled me away, and I stepped out to find James arguing with security, his eyes red-rimmed. He saw me and collapsed into a chair, sobbing that he'd just learned the full story from the news. A small shock came when he handed me a letter from Eleanor, smuggled out of jail, where she admitted everything but blamed our parents for favouring me. As I read it, Michael's monitor alarm blared and doctors rushed in, pushing me aside. I clung to Tommy, and through the glass, I saw Michael's heart rate flatline, the screen showing a straight line. The doctors worked frantically, but after 20 minutes, they stopped, and one shook his head. Michael was gone. I slumped against the wall, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of pain, and I needed to arrange his funeral and secure his legacy, but the loss felt like a hole in my chest. Eleanor's legal team was already challenging the will, and I recalled her knack for twisting grief into advantage. James helped me to a waiting room, his arm around me, and he promised to testify against Eleanor in court. Then, Lena arrived with news. The trust fund was temporarily frozen due to the fraud investigation, but Eleanor's assets were being seized. This gave me a sliver of hope. But as we discussed plans, my phone rang. A call from Child Services, saying Tommy's temporary custody was being reviewed because of the unstable environment. This unexpected threat made my blood run cold. I had to fight to keep him safe. I called my lawyer, but he said Eleanor had preemptively filed claims of negligence. As I hung up, James handed me a small key, saying Eleanor had hidden a safe deposit box with more evidence, and he'd found the location in her notes. We drove to the bank, but when we arrived, the box was already empty, and the manager said a woman with a court order had cleared it out hours ago. I turned to leave, and a familiar investigator stepped from the shadows, holding a folder. "Eleanor's not done with you," he said, tossing it at my feet. I picked up the folder, my hands trembling, and inside were photos of me with Tommy from the motel, doctored to look neglectful, along with a forged psychologist's report labeling me unfit. I needed to disprove these lies and protect Tommy, but the sheer audacity left me breathless. Eleanor's reach extended from her cell. She had accomplices still free, and I remembered her boasting about always having a plan B. Lena took the folder, promising to have it analysed for fraud, and we headed to the police station to file a complaint. There, we met Carol, who had decided to come forward publicly, and she provided signed statements about the switch. Then, my lawyer called, saying the court had scheduled an emergency hearing for Tommy's custody in 2 hours. This sudden deadline ratcheted up the pressure. I had to gather character witnesses and evidence fast. James offered to speak, and we rushed to the courthouse. But as we entered, I saw Eleanor being escorted in for a separate hearing, her eyes locking with mine. She mouthed, "You lose," and my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the news." I pulled it up, and a headline flashed. "Grandmother implicated in son's death?" The article suggested I'd neglected Michael's care, citing anonymous sources. I stared, stunned, and the bailiff called my name. But as I stepped forward, the investigator from the bank walked into the courtroom and took a seat beside Eleanor's lawyer. In the courtroom, I sat beside my attorney, my heart pounding as the judge reviewed the custody petition. I aimed to present my case calmly and refute the false allegations, but the public smear campaign made me feel exposed and vulnerable. Eleanor's team was well prepared. Her lawyer cited the news article and the forged report, and I recalled her cold advice to attack where it hurts. James took the stand, testifying about the switch and Eleanor's manipulations, and Lena followed with evidence of the framed photos. Then, Carol was called, and she detailed the hospital switch, her voice steady. This seemed to sway the judge, but Eleanor's lawyer produced a witness, the elderly woman from Carol's sister's house who claimed I'd threatened her. This interruption shocked me. She'd been coerced, and I objected, but the judge called a recess. In the hallway, I confronted the woman, and she broke down, admitting Eleanor had paid her. As we returned, my phone vibrated with a message from the bank. The trust fund had been unlocked and transferred to my name due to the fraud proof. This unexpected turn changed everything. I showed the document to my lawyer, and he presented it as evidence of my stability. The judge nodded, dismissing the custody petition, and ruled in my favour. But as I hugged Tommy, the bailiff approached, handing me a subpoena. I was being sued by Eleanor for defamation in a civil case, and the trial was set for next week. I took the paper, and across the room, Eleanor smirked, her eyes cold. After the hearing, I took Tommy home, the house feeling emptier without Michael, but filled with a fragile peace. I spent the days tending to his needs and sorting through Michael's belongings, finding old photos and letters that reminded me of the good times we had, despite the lies. The civil suit dragged on, but with Carol and James's testimony, it was eventually dismissed, and Eleanor was sentenced to prison for fraud and kidnapping. I visited her once, but she refused to see me, and I let go of the anger, realizing that holding on to it would only poison what remained. James and I grew closer, and he started calling me Mom, a word that now brought comfort instead of pain. The trust fund allowed me to set up a medical charity in Michael's name, helping other children with chronic illnesses, and Tommy thrived in school, his laughter easing the quiet moments. Years later, I sat on the porch with Tommy, now a teenager, and he asked about the past. I told him the story, not with bitterness, but as a lesson in resilience and love. As the sun set, I felt a sense of closure, not from revenge, but from the family I'd protected and the peace I'd built. The noise of the world faded, and in the stillness, I knew I had finally come home.